Okay, welcome back. This is actually a lecture that I wasn't planning on doing as a video online, but because we're running a little bit behind in class, I'm going to cover two lectures, a lecture on value and a lecture on page structure in video form as well, to help everyone catch up. We spent a little bit more time than I thought we would, but in a fun way, on a painting workshop, and so that was good. Anyway, so this first lecture is on value, and I'm going to do it, I think, in two parts. The first part focusing primarily on just kind of talking about the ways that value is created in a picture, in a two-dimensional image, two-dimensional work of art. And then in the second part, we'll talk about value contrast and how different ways of looking at value contrast, and also talking about the ways that value is used in a composition in terms of creating emphasis and in terms of grouping shapes together. Okay. So first of all, I just want to say, that since we've been in this unit talking about the Baroque, now is a very good time to be talking about value. And the Baroque is very much about contrast in general, and especially in terms of value contrast, the dramatic use of value contrast, dramatic use of lighting, especially in these kind of extreme forms of tenebrism, but in lots of Baroque art. But also keep in mind that in the Baroque, contrast goes beyond that as a value. Contrast is a value of thinking about all kinds of different compositional elements, contrasting one thing to another. So let's start with, how do we create value and value contrast? We've been talking about this in some ways right from the very beginning. When we started talking about drawing and we started talking about line and mark making, we've already been talking about some of the ways that you create value contrast and value changes in an image, in a two-dimensional work of art. So the ways you can do that include line weight, which we have talked about before, and repeating marks. So if you're still thinking in terms of a drawing or a print, talking about hatching and cross-hatching and use of cross-contour lines, especially when those cross-contour lines repeat closely to each other. But then creating also tones and gradations, and in some ways you can think about all tone as really just being about very, very small marks, but some tone and gradation is made where it literally is a tone, and some is tone that's created by literally making very tiny marks. If there's a distinction between those two visually, well, I'm not sure. But definitely for the artist working on it, there can be. One might be a lot more labor intensive than the other. But also don't forget that value can be created simply by, making distinct changes, painting this thing white and that thing gray and that thing black, or that shape blue, which leads to part 5, which is, do not forget that color, we already talked about color in the last unit, that all color is a value choice, right? That every color decision, whatever color it is both a hue choice, an intensity choice, and a value choice. So let's just start and look. We've seen both of these two images before, and because I really like the way they talk about line weight and the use of line weight, and as you can see, the change of line weight very much is a way of creating a sense of value, and both. There's literal value on the change of the piece of paper. There are places that are darker than others and other areas that are lighter, but it also creates the illusion of value, and that creates the illusion that there is light moving across the form. Take that further in hatching and cross-hatching, like on the ink drawing by Durer on the left, you can see that it is both, increasing the amount of how light one part of the page is versus how dark it is, but it's also even further increasing the sense of the illusion of light, moving across a form. And then if we go all the way to the print by Durer, you can really see that the tone is, it's made up of very, very small marks, but it really does feel like tone. So it is still a form of hatching and cross-hatching, and lots of those lines are very much based off of cross-contour, but they're so small and they're so compressed together that they really feel more like tone than anything else, which leads to this page. On these, Each of them, to a lesser degree, is made up of tone made out of small marks. Obviously, the Whistler, the print there, feels much more like pure tone. The the tone is created by little tiny dots of ink that are created from the plate, but it's not as visible. Whereas in the lithograph print by Fantin-Latour, you can more clearly see the hand of all the marks. It still has the feel of tone, but also has the feel of, of a hatched mark. Whereas the Prud'homme, unfortunately, the easy vid thing always gets in the way there. The Proudhon figure study um, is kind of like in between. If you really look at it, is made up of just lots of marks, right? Lots of dark marks, lots of light marks. It's on a toned piece of paper with very light hatching and cross contour marks with a white chalk and with a black chalk. And but the feel is very tonal. Like it really does, when you look at, of course, in the reproduction, you lose some of the actual marks that way. So, and lastly, I want to get back to the point I made before, which is don't forget that, value contrast can be created simply by placing a shape as one value and another shape as another value. When you're looking at this, don't forget that this shape is a shape and a choice of value that's distinct from the shape and choice of value of the canvas. He was definitely thinking about the canvas as a color, and the white of the paint as a color. And then also don't forget, poor Ellsworth Kelly, don't forget that color is itself a distinct value choice. Even when we're talking about pure saturated color, whatever color that whether it's straight out of the tube or whatever color you mix, it is always going to be a specific value, and it's often going to be a very distinct value from the value that's next to it, creating a clear edge and a value contrast. I love this photograph by Sugimoto, and it is a good example of a very soft, even tone. Okay, that's the end of part 1. I'll get back to you with part 2.